Hello, 2BC. Thank you so much for joining me today. We are continuing our journey through Genesis, and this week we will be continuing Jacob's story and looking at Genesis 29 through 36. Why don't we pray as we get started? God, I thank you so much for today. I thank you that we get to come together and open your word. I pray that as we do so, you'll teach us, you'll transform us, and you'll just show us something about yourself. God, we love you and we pray all of this in your holy and precious name, Jesus. Amen. So we are returning to Jacob's story today as we continue this journey through Genesis. Now, we left Jacob several weeks ago, back before Easter, and he was on his way to his uncle Laban. And he'd been fleeing from his brother Esau because Esau was angry, and he's on his way to Laban, and he had the dream of the angels ascending and descending on a ladder, and God met with him at Bethel, and that is where we left Jacob. He was on his way. So this section of Genesis, starting in chapter 29, is going to take us through Jacob's arrival at Padan Aram, his time living with his uncle Laban, and all of the wives that he marries and the children he has. So he's with Laban for 20 years and all of that before he finally then returns home. So this section is going to cover all of that. So his arrival, his stay with Laban, and then his return back home. So we're going to walk through it. We are going to walk through it rather quickly, but we will zero in on some different passages or different sections as we go through. So let's pick things up here in chapter 29. We're told that Jacob continues his journey and he comes to the land of the eastern peoples. He comes to the land of his ancestors, and he very quickly encounters shepherds at the well. And Rachel comes out. She is with the sheep, Laban's sheep, and comes to this well. And so Rachel is the first family member that he encounters here in the land of Padan Aram. And if you remember, Laban was Rebekah's brother. So whenever Abraham sent his servant back to the land of his ancestors to find a wife for Isaac, he finds Rebekah, meets Rebekah at the well. Very similar, there's a lot of similarities here between that experience with Abraham's servant going to find a wife for Isaac and with Jacob meeting Rachel for the first time. Rachel is the first person that Jacob encounters from his uncle's family. And he is so relieved and happy to meet her that he weeps. And Laban finds out and he welcomes Jacob in immediately. It says he embraced and kissed him and brought him to his home. And there Jacob told him all these things. And Laban said, "You are my own flesh and blood." So he is staying there with his uncle. He's accepted in. It is exactly what you would expect the welcome to be. Very, very hospitable, very welcoming. "Oh, you are the son of my sister who I have not seen." Because remember, Laban would not have seen Rebekah. When she left to go become Isaac's wife, she had not been back. And they didn't have ways to communicate. So this was essentially his first communication, possibly, or hearing how things were going even with his sister for the first time. Now, could they have sent letters or messages back and forth? Sure. Did they? We're not told. But regardless, this is his first time to see his nephew. And he welcomes him and Jacob stays with Laban. And after a month, Laban says, just because you're a relative, should you work for me for nothing? Tell me what your wages should be. Now, Jacob had fallen in love with Rachel. We are told that she was beautiful and that she was the younger sister, and that Leah was the older sister and she was not as beautiful. She's described as having weak eyes. And that is an unusual description. Lots of Bible scholars have had many thoughts on what that actually means. But regardless, Jacob loved Rachel and wanted to marry her. And so Laban said, of course. So I would rather her go to you than to some stranger. And so stay here with me. So Jacob works for Laban, so taking care of his flocks. Jacob is functioning at this point very much like an indentured servant. And so he works for Laban for 7 years to earn Rachel's hand. And at the end of 7 years, Jacob is ready to marry his wife, and he encounters the trickery of his uncle really for the first time. And so Jacob, remember his name means trickster. He meets a trickster who on the wedding night brings his daughter Leah instead of his daughter Rachel. And Jacob doesn't know until the next morning, which that's kind of a weird situation. Anyway, how did he not know? Like, what in the world is going on? Now he has Leah, but not Rachel. And he's upset about that. And so Laban says, well, it's not the custom for us to give the younger daughter first. So work for me for another 7 years, and I'll go ahead and give you Rachel, but you have to stay for another 7 years working for me. And so after a short period of time, he also marries Rachel. So now Jacob has 2 wives, and he loves Rachel. And we're told that, so if you look in verse 30, it says, his love for Rachel was greater than his love for Leah. And this is going to play out in the rest of Jacob's story and cause strife for his family all the way through the end of Genesis. So he's going to prefer Rachel and her offspring to Leah and hers, but God is going to bless Leah. And so he enables her to have children, and she has many children. So while Leah is beginning to have all of these children, Rachel remains childless. And so she gives birth to a son named Reuben. And then a little bit later, she gives birth to a son named Simeon. Then she gives birth to Levi, and then Judah. And then we're told that she stopped having children. She will again have children as we keep going in the story. But she gives birth to 4 sons in a row. And so what we're going to see here in 29 and 30 is really the beginning, the birth of the 12 tribes of Israel. Through all of these sons that Leah, and then later on 2 servants and Rachel will have. One interesting thing to note here about Leah and her children is that she names them. It's very interesting. She's the one who named Reuben and Simeon and Levi and Judah. And I encourage you to go and look at their different names and what they mean. And they're very much connected with what God is doing. So his work and his response to her and her suffering. So her being unloved by her husband. But Rachel, in the meantime, is realizing she's bearing no children. And for a woman at that time, that was what she was supposed to do. The pinnacle experience, the way that she was going to be provided for as she aged, all of those things was to have children and to specifically have male children, to provide sons to her husband. And she's not able to do that. So she has Jacob's love, but she has no children. So really we see Leah and Rachel wanting what each other have. Leah wants the love of her husband, and God gives her all of the children. Rachel has the love of her husband, but she wants the children. And so she comes up with an idea, and this isn't the first time we've seen this in Genesis, and it won't be the last, and says, well, here, you can have my servant, Bilhah, because one of the things that their father Laban did when each of the girls got married is he also gave them a servant. So she takes her servant Bilhah and says, here, you can have her as a wife, and you can sleep with her and have children, and that way I can have children and build my family through her. And this is it's the same kind of arrangement we see with Hagar back with Abraham and Sarah. And so she does it, and Jacob listens. Like, this is a soap opera. She became pregnant, bore him a son. Rachel is the one who names these children. She names him Dan, and then it happens again, and she names this son Naphtali. And then Leah sees what's going on and doesn't like it. And so she gives her servant to Jacob as a wife, Zilpah. And then Zilpah bears sons for Jacob, Gad, and then another son, Asher. And Leah, of course, names them. And so both of these women are going to have children through their servants that will be then their children. is interesting though, because unlike what happened with Hagar, these children of Bilhah and Zilpah, they are not going to be sent away like Ishmael was. So Hagar and Ishmael eventually are sent away. But these children and these wives are going to be kept as part of the family. But Zilpah and Bilhah would not have had any say in the arrangement. They were slaves and they were told, this is what you're going to do. So they didn't get to say no. They had to do it. So we're told after all of the servants are having children for Jacob, then Leah has more. God opens her womb again. That is one thing we do get here very loud and clear, is that children are God's gift. So God is the one who's opening wombs and enabling these women to have children. And so Leah has another son, Issachar, and then she has another one named Zebulun. And then finally she has a daughter named Dinah, and all of them are named. And then we're finally told that God remembers Rachel. So all of these other children have been born before Rachel even has one. And Rachel has Joseph. So Jacob's family is quite messy. 4 wives, a lot of children, probably an unimaginable amount of drama, all while he's still living in the land of his uncle Laban, and he's still indentured to him. So then the second half of chapter 30 is going to cover, how does Jacob's wealth increase? So there's a lot about babies and there's a lot about livestock in chapter 30. So lots of children are born, and then we're told how Jacob's wealth increases while he is still living with his uncle Laban. And I encourage you to go and read that for yourself. And you can see how God blesses Jacob and continues to work on his behalf, even though Jacob and his family are incredibly messy. And we see God's provision anyway, saying, you are my people. I'm still going to be working and moving in your midst and calling you forward. And so he is providing for Jacob, even though Laban is continuing to be a bit of a trickster. So as Jacob's flocks are continuing to multiply and his families continue to increase in number, God comes to him and says that you need to go back to the land of your fathers and to your relatives, and I will be there with you. So you remember at Bethel on his way, Jacob says, when I return here, I'm going to worship you. And he takes a vow to worship the Lord. And God is promising to be with him wherever he goes. And so God is saying, hey, it's time for you to go back. Now, at this point, it has been 20 years. We had the 7 years working for Leah, and then the 7 more years working for Rachel. And then we're told there's 6 years of earning his flocks, and God increasing the flocks in number there before they flee. And so Genesis 31 gives us those details of their fleeing Laban. So the journey away, and then Laban pursuing them and accusing Jacob of stealing his household gods, which Rachel actually did steal them, but she's able to hide them. That's a very interesting story. And God also providing and protecting them, and having warned Laban, like God warns Laban, hey, don't have anything to do with Jacob. And despite Jacob's messy family, God is protecting them, and he's with them as they are fleeing and returning to the land of Jacob's birth. So then let's pick up here in chapter 32, because the other part of this journey that is so significant is that Jacob is returning to the land where his brother Esau lives. And if you remember, whenever he leaves 20 years prior, Esau is not happy with him. He's plotting to murder Jacob because Jacob has stolen his blessing. So that has been 20 years. And I would imagine it's been 20 years without any contact. So Jacob doesn't know what he's walking into. He knows God has told him to go back. He knows that God has promised to be with him. But he doesn't know what he's returning to with regards to his brother. So chapter 32 starts this way. Jacob also went on his way, and the angels of God met him. When Jacob saw them, he said, this is the camp of God. So he named that place Mahanaim. And so angels of God come to meet Jacob. So Laban is left. They're on their way again. And God is reminding Jacob, hey, I'm with you. I'm in this place. I am going to continue on this journey with you. And so Jacob goes ahead and prepares to encounter Esau. So the first thing he does is he reaches out. He sends messengers to Esau, and he tells his messengers, "Tell Esau, your servant Jacob says, I have been staying with Laban and have remained there till now. I have cattle and donkeys, sheep and goats, male and female servants. Now I am sending this message to my Lord that I might find favor in your eyes." These messengers return and they tell Jacob, "We went to your brother and now he's coming to meet you. And oh, by the way, he's coming with 400 men." Not the response that Jacob was hoping for, even though he was using deferential language. And we'll see him continue to use very deferential language with regard to Esau through this whole section, even whenever he does meet him in chapter 33. How would you feel if you were Jacob? I would be scared. And we see Jacob we were told in verse 7, great fear and distress. So he divides his whole group into two camps, including all of his livestock. And thinking that if Esau comes and attacks them, maybe he'll just attack one group and the other group would be able to flee. The second thing he does is that he prays. And so let's look at his prayer in verse 9. It says, "Then Jacob prayed, O God of my father Abraham, God of my father Isaac, Lord, you who said to me, go back to your country and your relatives, and I will make you prosper. I am unworthy of all the kindness and faithfulness you have shown your servant. I had only my staff when I crossed this Jordan, but now I have become two camps. Save me, I pray, from the hand of my brother Esau, for I am afraid he will come and attack me, and also the mothers with their children. But you have said, I will surely make you prosper and will make your descendants like the sand of the sea, which cannot be counted." So he prays and asks for God's protection, asks for God to save him. And he reminds, it sounds like he's trying to remind God, but he was recalling God's past action, God's promises, God's promise to make him into a great nation with numerous descendants, and saying, hey, I need you to do something here, because I don't know what's going to happen. And I love that we get to see Jacob come to God in this way, because this is a unique prayer in Genesis. We have lots of encounters with God, but this is a very heartfelt prayer just for salvation, for God to protect him and his family. And it sounds very much like the laments that we read in the book of Psalms. God, this is who you are. This is who you've said you are. This is how you've worked in the past. This is what you've promised to do in the future. Where are you? Save me. It says he spent the night there, and then the third thing he does to prepare is he selects a gift for his brother Esau. And we see he has 5 herds or flocks that he has picked. So 200 female goats, 20 male goats, 200 ewes, 20 rams, 30 female camels, 40 cows, and 10 bulls, and 20 female donkeys and 10 male donkeys. So he puts all of these into groups being taken care of by his servants, and he sends them out ahead of him and wanting them to be spaced out as they're going so that Esau will encounter all of these different herds, and he instructs them to tell Esau that they belong to your servant Jacob, and they are gifts sent to you, to my lord Esau, and he is coming behind us. Because Jacob is hoping to mollify, to appease, to pacify Esau with these gifts in order to make peace. Now, was Jacob feeling guilty because of what he did to Esau all of those years ago? Or is he just trying to save himself and his family? I would think that there's a little bit of all of it. He's very deferential, even in his first reaching out to Esau, very deferential in his language. I think he genuinely is wanting to appease for his past sins. Maybe this is his way of saying like, hey, I have received the blessing. I'm still receiving the blessing here. I want to give you some of it that I stole from you. Maybe that's what he's doing. We're not told all of that. So all of this has happened. And then he decides to cross over the river at night. And this is where in verse 22, we have 22 through 32, we have a very interesting encounter. So Jacob gets his family across the river and all of his sons and gets them safe. And he's left alone. And this man comes and wrestles with him. We're told a man wrestled with him until daybreak. So like a matter of fact, I have so many questions. I'm sure you do too. It's like, I want to know this and this and this and this. But we're not told. We're just told a man comes and wrestles with him until daybreak. We would like to kind of know, did he just like jump out of the shadows? Like, how did this go down? But we're not told all of those details. But they wrestle all night long. It's a very ominous sounding experience. Here, Jacob was anticipating a meeting with his brother Esau the next day, but now he's wrestling with this random stranger at night. And initially, we have no clue as to who this stranger is. We have a few clues as to that he has divine qualities, because it says he could not overpower him, so he touched the socket of Jacob's hip so that his hip was wrenched as he wrestled with the man. So he had the ability to basically disable Jacob or make him an inefficient fighter just by a touch. And this has been interpreted in many, many ways, but the identity of this stranger is somewhat hidden, because whenever he says, then the man said, let me go, for it's daybreak. And Jacob says, I will not let you go unless you bless me. And the man asks him, what is your name? And then Jacob responds with Jacob. And the man says, your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have struggled with God and with humans and have overcome. Jacob said, please tell me your name. But he replied, why do you ask my name? And then he blessed him there. And so Jacob's response is to call the place Peniel, which means face of God, because I saw God face to face, and yet my life was spared. So Jacob is interpreting this encounter as an encounter with God in some way, and is recognizing that there is something of God here with him wrestling. And I think it's interesting because just a few verses earlier, Jacob is praying that God will save him. And then he has this encounter with God. And he's left wounded from that encounter, which would then, you would think, make him less able to fight if Esau is in fact coming to attack him, and make him have to be even more reliant on God. So now he can't rely on any of his own strength because he's wounded. He has a limp. He has wrestled all night with God. So he prays, and God does show up. And we'll see that God does in fact protect him as we continue reading this story. But I wanted to look at this name change. So he says that your name will no longer be Jacob, which means trickster, and instead it's going to be Israel. Now the etymology of Israel is a little bit unclear, but it seems here that it's connected with this idea of struggling with God, this striving with God, with humans, and have overcome. It could also mean God rules, God preserves, God protects, but it's definitely connected with struggle. And I think as we look across, because we know that Israel, Jacob has been renamed Israel. Israel will become the nation of Israel. And as we look across the history of the nation of Israel in the Old Testament, we see them struggle with God a lot. And that idea of struggle and wrestling with God just seems to be a part of who they are as a people. So we see that kind of played out in the rest of the Old Testament. And then we're told the etiology, so the reason for why Israelites do not eat the tendon attached to the socket of the hip. And so like we're saying, this is the reason why we do this thing. And so remember, Genesis is a book of origin stories. So we get origins of lots of things. And here they're pointing out, hey, this is their origin of the reason we do this. Then we finally get to the long-awaited meeting between Jacob and Esau. And Jacob looks up, and there's Esau with all 400 of his men coming right at him. So he divides his children with their mothers, and he puts them in order. And he's going to put them in order of his preference. So he puts his 2 servants with their children in front, then Leah with her children, and then finally Rachel with Joseph at the back, trying to keep them as far away from Esau as possible. Once again, we see his preference for Rachel, and it's going to continue to plague him throughout the rest of Genesis. But he goes out in front, and he goes and bows down to the ground. So this deferential response to his brother as he approaches Esau. But Esau runs to him, and they hug, and throws his arms around him, and he kisses him, and they weep. And this is not, to me, this is a surprising response. Esau was so angry when Jacob stole his blessing. But yet 20 years have gone by, and they are able to come together in just this beautiful scene of reunification, reconciliation, this hatred that they both seem to harbor towards each other appears to have vanished. And Jacob is able to give him lavish gifts. Esau is saying, "You're my brother," and invites him to come to where he lives in Seir. And Esau knows what the blessing was. He is going to serve his brother. That was what his blessing was. It's like what Isaac was able to say to him was, well, you're going to serve your brother. You're going to be a servant to him. You're going to live by the sword. You're going to be a servant to your brother. But yet he embraces him anyways. Now, Jacob doesn't go to Seir. We're told that he goes to the land of Canaan and to the land of promise, where God is directing them to settle. But they are reconciled to one another. We'll see them come together again to bury their father Isaac at the end of chapter 35. But they are back together. Jacob and his family have returned to the land of promise, to the land of Canaan, and they are going to worship God there. Now, chapter 34 is, we go from the heights of this forgiveness and reunification and coming back to the land of promise straight into the depths. And we see a terrible story. So Leah had a daughter named Dinah, and she is taken by Shechem and raped, and he is keeping her there. And it is a terrible, but then he decides he wants to marry her, and it's a terrible story. It's a disturbing story for so many reasons. So he takes her and he rapes her, but he loves her and he wants her to be his wife. So he tells his dad to go get her. And this whole negotiation between Hamor and Jacob's sons, and all of this, Dinah is being held. She's not returned to her family. She is still being held by Shechem in his household. And that's very disturbing also. But we're told that Jacob doesn't do anything, that he remains silent. His sons are away, then they come back. His sons are completely outraged, especially Simeon and Levi, who are Dinah's brothers. They are her brothers, actual sons of Leah. And so they're the ones who are leading this negotiation. And they are deceptive and deceitful and cook up this plan to, of course you can have her, but you're going to have to be circumcised, and all of the males in your city are going to have to be circumcised. And when they agree to it, they wait until all the men are hurting from the procedure, and they go and they slaughter them all. And they get their sister and bring her back, and they plunder. The other sons go and plunder. So Simeon and Levi go and slaughter, and then the other sons go and plunder and take all the livestock, take all the women and children. This is a terrible story. It started terrible. It ends terrible. There's not a way to put a pretty face on it, but it happens. And it's written down in Genesis 34. And Jacob's upset because he is worried that he's going to be attacked by all of the other people because they're going to not accept him in the land. But his sons are upset. So we see this strife because they're upset he did nothing when his daughter was treated like a prostitute. And so it's just this strife and messiness and terribleness that happens and exists in Jacob's family. But yet God is at work despite all of that and continues to move them forward, continues to move them and draw them to himself. And we know this is the beginning of the 12 tribes of Israel. This is a continuation of the blessing that he promised to Abraham, and it will continue on all the way down where Jesus is going to be from the tribe of Judah. So despite all of this terrible horribleness, we see God continuing to work. And for me, this story in Genesis 34 reminds me of the harshness of that time period. The harshness of that time period for being a woman, the harshness of that time period for being just a human in general. There was lots of war. Life was not secure. I think we don't understand that kind of environment. We live in relative safety, and aren't just at not being threatened, just walking outside. And so to try to understand and put ourselves in that situation is almost impossible. At least it is for me. And so it just reminds me that this culture, the reality, the harsh reality of the culture of the ancient Near East, where there was warring tribes and warring everything, and women were treated like property and people were treated like property as their servants. And it was a harsh reality. And it's not pretty. And it's not okay. It's a harsh reality of sin. But God, in all of his goodness, wasn't thrown off by that and continues to work and continues to call people to himself. This brings us to chapter 35, where God again meets with Jacob and tells him, hey, go back to Bethel. Remember, Bethel is where God met with Jacob for the first time after that vision that he had, and God promises to be with him wherever you go. And he says, go up to Bethel and settle there and build an altar there to God, who appeared to you when you were fleeing from your brother Esau. And so we see Jacob and his family then prepare for this pilgrimage to Bethel, where they're going to worship God and where they're going to settle. So remember, they're very nomadic still. They're settled in the land, but they're going to move. They're have livestock, so they're going to have to move their livestock around anyways. But they are preparing for a pilgrimage to this place of God, this house of God, Bethel. And they prepare for this encounter with God by getting rid of all the foreign gods you have with you and purify yourselves and change your clothes. Who knows all of the things they have plundered from Shechem after the massacre there. They take all of those things, all of those idols, and it says they also the rings in their ears, and Jacob buries them under the oak at Shechem. But he says, we're going to go to Bethel and build an altar to God. And he describes God this way: who answered me in the day of my distress, and who has been with me wherever I've gone. So he describing God based on what God has done, how he has experienced God at work in his life. God has been with him, and he has answered him whenever he is in distress. And so his family does what he asks, and they bury their idols and they set out. And we're told in verse 5 that the terror of God fell on the towns all around them so that no one pursued them. And we'll see a very similar situation go on whenever the Israelites, after having wandered in the desert for 40 years, as they come into the promised land and begin to conquer it. So we see that in Joshua, where this terror of God has kind of gone before them, and the people are afraid. The people of the land are afraid, and so they don't come out to actively attack Israel. And so they go to Bethel in the land of Canaan, and he builds an altar, and he calls the place El Bethel, because it was there that God revealed himself to him when he was fleeing from his brother. And then we are told that God appears to him again and reiterates the name change to Israel. And he says, I am God Almighty, be fruitful and increase in number. A nation and a community of nations will come from you, and kings will be among your descendants. The land I gave to Abraham and Isaac, I also give to you, and I will give this land to your descendants after you. Then God went up from him at that place where he had talked with him. And so Jacob sets up a stone pillar where God had talked with him, and he pours out a drink offering and poured oil on it, and he called the place where God had talked with him Bethel, house of God. We're told as they are moving on from Bethel that Rachel begins to give birth. She's we didn't know she was pregnant, but she is, and she begins to give birth, but she dies in childbirth. And as she's dying, she names her son Ben-Oni, which is son of my sorrow. But his father named him Benjamin. So Jacob changes his name to Benjamin, which means son of my right hand. So Rachel dies, and this is near Bethlehem. And so she's buried there. So she only was able to bear 2 children for Jacob. Joseph and Benjamin. We know Joseph's story is going to be kind of the focus of most of the rest of Genesis. But then we have more sorrow where Reuben decides to sleep with his father's slave wife, Bilhah, which is weird. It's just weird. But he does. And then we get a list of Jacob's sons. And then this chapter closes with the death of Isaac, which this has always amused me because when Isaac wants to bless Esau and then Jacob steals the blessing, he's essentially saying, I'm old and I think I'm going to die soon. But then it's like at least 20 years go by and he's still alive because it says that Jacob and Esau bury him. So I just have always found that interesting and amusing. But Jacob and Esau come together to bury their father. And then chapter 36 is the last part of the section that we're going to cover in this video. And it is essentially Esau's genealogy. We have a list of all of his descendants. You remember he married 2 Canaanite women, and he also married a daughter of Ishmael. And Esau's descendants are going to become the nation of Edom, who will be Israel's close neighbor. Rebekah had been promised that there were 2 nations in her womb, Edom and Israel. And so we see that here. And that brings us to chapter 37, which is going to start the Joseph narrative. And we'll have a video for that next week. This has been such an interesting journey as we have studied all of these origins. So I hope that you will take the time to slow down and read Jacob's story. There's a lot of foundational things that happen here that will play out over the rest of Scripture. So that's all for this video. Bye.